Good evening, everyone. My name is Maureen Wilson, Councillor for Ward 1 in the City of Hamilton. Welcome. It is June the 24th, 2021, and tonight's public meeting has to do with Hamilton's urban boundary. First of all, thank you very much for being here with us and taking time out. I will speak to the roadmap, if you will, for the evening, make some introductions. But before I do that, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The City of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the City of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. And regretfully, today is another reminder of the importance of that commitment and the need for us to journey along truth and reconciliation, if only to honor those who have been lost because of policies that took direct aim at who they were as a people. So thank you very much. Tonight, joining me from the City of Hamilton, and I'm very grateful for their talent and their time, is Heather Travis and Lauren Vreitz. They are planners in the policy section of the planning department in the City of Hamilton, and they've been knee-deep in this study for quite some time, and I'm thanking them for taking time out of that practice, and they're very willing to be here because they understand the importance of this. So in your mail, you may have already received a survey, and it's from the City of Hamilton. If you've tossed it in your blue box, we don't have pickup until next week, so run and get it because it is really important. Some of my colleagues around the Horseshoe have called it the most important decision that this council will have to make. And why is that? Because how we grow as a city and where we grow as a city will have direct consequences for us as residents and for the future generation of Hamiltonians. Financial consequences, environmental consequences, consequences having to do with how we connect with one another, consequences for the land that we can leave for nature or for farmers, and how we grow and connect and travel, and it also has implications for everything from classroom sizes to the viability of some of our commercial activities and small and large businesses. So it is significant. And I think it's also a rather dense, if I could say, exercise. But if we can weed through that dense information and land on some principles that we think should guide us in our decision-making as a community, I think we'll be better for it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Heather and Lauren, and they're going to give a presentation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you, Councillor. Just a little backgrounder on key terms that we're going to be using going forward. So you've likely heard the term GRIDS 2 and MCR in the lead up to the meeting. For a quick review, GRIDS stands for Growth-Related Integrated Development Strategy, and it's a long-term planning exercise to the year 2051 that considers where the next 30 years of forecasted growth of people and jobs to Hamilton will be located, and it helps to inform future infrastructure planning. The MCR stands for Municipal Comprehensive Review. The city is required by the province to update the urban and rural official plan policies to bring them into conformity with the applicable provincial policy documents, like the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So a little bit on provincial forecasts. The forecasts for population and job growth for the next 30 years to 2051 are provided in the growth plan. The city is required to plan for growth using the forecast in the growth plan. In terms of population growth, Schedule 3 of the growth plan forecasts that over the next 30 years, Hamilton will grow by 236,000 residents for a population of approximately 820,000 by 2051. For job growth, Hamilton is forecast to grow by 122,000 jobs in the same time period, resulting in a total of approximately 360,000 jobs. As mentioned, the GRIDS project is incorporating these forecasts in order to determine the city's growth options for the future. The MCR process will be informed by the GRIDS work and will update the city's official plans to reflect the population and job growth forecast and necessary changes to land use policies and mapping as a result. This is a really important time in our city's growth planning, and there are several key decisions that must be made. In terms of timing, the city must complete its municipal comprehensive review and pass an official plan amendment to have its official plans in conformity with all the provincial policies by the July of 2022. This means that the city must complete its population and job growth planning exercise well in advance to allow time for draft changes to the official plans and to circulate these plans and drafts internally and for public review and comment. Key decisions for the city to make through this growth planning exercise is whether or not an urban boundary expansion is required to accommodate some of the forecasted growth over the next 30 years. To make this decision, the city must complete a land needs assessment, which we'll discuss in the next slide. So a land needs assessment, what we'll often refer to as an LNA, you'll probably hear that term a lot tonight, is a way for the city to investigate how much land is currently available for population and job growth and how much more land might be needed over the next 30 years. The province, through the Ontario Growth Secretariat, has established a land needs assessment methodology that all upper and single-tier municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe must follow to assess the quantity of land required for future growth. In August of 2020, the province released a revised LNA methodology that takes a market-based approach to determine how much land municipalities will need. This means that for population and job growth, the land needs assessment must consider market trends and demographics for demand for different housing types and employment. In the end, the land needs assessment considers two types of land use categories: community area land need, which is required for housing, commercial development, institutional uses, and jobs related to those uses; and employment land need, which is land that we usually associate with employment areas like industrial and manufacturing uses, warehousing and logistics, and business parks. The city retained a land economist to complete the land needs assessment, and the results are what Heather will speak to in the next part of the presentation. Heather?
Great, thanks, Lauren. So as Lauren noted, the city retained a consultant, Laureus & Associates, to complete a land needs assessment for the city in accordance with the provincial methodology. In its simplest terms, the land needs assessment is a supply and demand calculation. We know the demand side, as Lauren noted, which is the forecast of population and jobs, which we receive from the province, and which we are mandated to plan for as a municipality. So then we look to the supply side. The LNA considers how many new housing units will be built within the city's built-up area through intensification and redevelopment, how many will be built in the designated greenfield area, and how many in the rural area. And I'll break that down a little bit now. So the number of units that we assume to be built in what we call the built-up area represents our intensification target. And on the side in front of you, the city's built-up area is the area that's shown in red on the map. So on the outline, on the map, the black outline is the city's urban boundary. Everything within that black outline is considered urban area. And the portion in red is really a subset of our urban area. And it's what the province calls our built-up area. And essentially, it's the lands that are already developed. Any new housing units that are developed each year within that built-up area contribute toward the city's intensification target. And the intensification target has a significant impact on overall land need. The growth plan requires the city to plan for a minimum intensification target of 50%, meaning that each year 50% of our new housing units will be developed within that built-up area. Next, we determine how many units can be developed within the city's existing designated greenfield areas, or DGA, as we sometimes call it, and that's the areas shown in green on the map. These are areas that are generally undeveloped, but some of them, or much of this land, is actually already planned or proposed for planning through a draft plan with subdivision or a secondary plan. So these are lands that are already identified for residential development in the future, but just are not fully developed yet. So we determine how much of that anticipated housing growth can be accommodated on those greenfield lands. And then once we have made these determinations, we can identify a shortfall of units that would need to be accommodated in a future urban boundary expansion area, potentially. Finally, we add allowance for other uses that we need to plan for in new communities, aside from residential uses, which would include schools, parks, commercial uses, and other uses that require space. And the sum of these calculations provides us with our required land need, or urban boundary expansion area. So the city went through this process and completed a draft land needs assessment with the assistance of our consultant. And the land needs assessment actually looked at 4 different land need scenarios. And the big difference between those 4 scenarios was the intensification rate, or the assumption about intensification that each scenario made. And the scenarios ranged from an assumption of quite a low intensification rate, about 40%, which is equivalent to roughly what the city achieves on average right now, to a high of an average of 60% intensification over the next 30 years. And the higher we push the intensification target, the less resulting urban expansion land need was required. So it's a direct relationship between the higher the intensification we plan for, the less urban expansion land need will be required. So after completing the land needs exercise, staff recommended the intensification scenario, which modeled the highest intensification rate of 60% intensification on average over the next 30 years. We call it the ambitious density scenario. And it's modeled on an assumption that our intensification rate will gradually increase over the next 30 years. So for the first 10 years of our planning period, we're targeting an intensification rate of 50%. That will rise to 60% in the middle of the period, and 70% for the last 10 years. So it averages to 60% overall. And that equates to about 66,000 intensification units being developed in the city over that 30-year period. The ambitious density scenario also assumes that any new urban boundary expansion areas would be developed at a higher density than we've typically seen in the past, 77 persons and jobs per hectare, as opposed to our existing greenfield areas. Those are the areas that we see in green, as I mentioned, which are planned to achieve a density of about 60 persons and jobs per hectare. So that gives you a feeling for how the new areas would be planned at a higher density than what we've typically seen in new suburban areas, for example, in recent years. The outcome of this ambitious density scenario, the one that is being recommended by staff, is a requirement for an urban boundary expansion of 1,340 hectares, or approximately 3,300 acres. And so just to put a little bit more understanding about when we talk about urban boundary expansion, what does that mean? So here's another map on the screen, and this is a map that's really more of a close-up of the city's existing southern boundary. So you can see the link in the center. Here's Upper James going north-south. On this map, the area in gray is our existing urban area. Once again, you can see the urban boundary outlined in the black. The land, so everything that's outside of that gray area is right now considered rural lands. The area that is green within the rural area are the lands that are protected by the Greenbelt Plan. They're within the protected countryside. And the lands that are either white on this map or blue are lands that are rural, but they're not within the Greenbelt Plan. And we call these the White Belt lands. Now, the White Belt lands are further broken up by lands that are within what we call this purple line. It's the 28 Noise Exposure Forecast Contour Line, or NEF line, around the airport. And the reason this line is important is because any land that is above that 28 contour line, so closer to the airport, within that contour line cannot be used for residential development in the future or any other sensitive land use because of potential noise concerns arising from the airport. So those lands in blue, what we're showing in blue, are lands that, if they were to be developed in the future, could only be used for employment uses or a non-sensitive land use, like so any sort of commercial or industrial manufacturing use. Now, as it happens, and I didn't mention this when in our land needs assessment, our land needs assessment has found that the city does not need to add any additional lands to our urban area for employment uses for the next 30 years. Again, it is draft right now, but as it stands right now, we have not identified a need for any additional employment lands. So these lands that you see in blue will remain, at least again, according to the draft land needs assessment, it hasn't been approved yet, but would remain rural, well, for the next, at least for the remainder of the next planning period. It's the lands in white that we could consider for potential urban boundary expansion if the land needs assessment ambitious density scenario were to be ultimately approved and endorsed by council. These lands in white are the areas that the city would be looking to consider for urban boundary expansion. And those are the only areas that we can consider. There's a very minor exception for a small expansion from Waterdown or Binbrook. It's up only a maximum of 10 hectares. So I don't really want to confuse that with this process right now, but I just want to note that that is the only very minor exception for any potential expansion into the Greenbelt Plan. Really, the city's growth options are limited to these white belt areas that you can see on the map. So then in terms of why we're here today and why we sent out this survey after completing our draft land needs assessment, we just have to go back a little bit to March of this year. So in March of 2021, staff presented the results of the draft land needs assessment to the General Issues Committee of Council. It recommended that the city, as I mentioned, adopt the ambitious density scenario. At that meeting, council heard from many delegates who expressed concern about the staff recommendation for their urban boundary expansion and the lack of consideration of a no urban boundary expansion option. In addition, the limitations of virtual public engagement were also noted by a number of delegates, and limitations on folks who weren't able to participate in some of the online engagement that we did undertake on the land needs assessment. So council directed that staff should undertake additional public consultation on the important question of urban boundary expansion, which, as the councillor noted, is or could be considered the most significant decision the city may be planning for in the near future. And so directed that we conduct a mail-out survey to each household in Hamilton. Again, being cognizant of the limitations of virtual public engagement, it was identified that a mail-out survey would ensure that those who could not participate in the previous round of engagement could still be engaged in the process and could have their voice heard. So council directed that staff conduct a citywide mail consultation with a survey on the land needs assessment and the municipal comprehensive review. That includes the ambitious density scenario, which I just went over, a no urban boundary expansion scenario, and that also allows residents to submit their own alternative scenario. So that's what we did. And the survey that you see, or that you hopefully have received in the mail by now, the surveys started to go out this week, but we understand from Canada Post that everybody may be receiving them on different dates. It just depends on the Canada Post schedule. But I know many people have already received their copy. The survey does identify those 3 options to be chosen as directed by council. So you'll see on the survey when you receive it, we've provided some explanation of what these 3 options mean. So option 1 being the ambitious density scenario, and what that means in terms of the number of new housing units that we'll be planning for within our urban area over the next 30 years, what that means for an intensification target, and then at the bottom, the resulting urban expansion land need, as I mentioned, about 1,300 hectares or 3,300 acres. Option 2 is the no urban boundary expansion scenario, which really requires that all of our new housing units that we anticipate over the next 30 years be developed within our existing urban area. We assume very limited development in our rural area, as it is meant to be protected for rural and agricultural uses for the long term, and new residential units are generally not permitted in the rural area. So we assume then that we're planning for 110,000 new units within our existing urban boundary under option 2, and that we'll be planning for 0 new housing units through urban boundary expansion, resulting in an urban expansion land need of 0 hectares. So that's the firm urban boundary option. And again, then there's option 3, which is other suggestions. If folks have an idea for a higher or a lower intensification rate or different assumptions around density or anything else that we might not have thought of, there is that opportunity to fill that in as well. So in terms of options for responding to the survey, we have been getting a lot of questions on this. So the simplest and the easiest way for those who have received the survey in the mail is to respond via the postage paid replied card. It can just be removed from the survey and dropped in any mailbox. We did, however, also include the option to respond to the survey through email, because we have heard from some people who have indicated that more than one person in their household wishes to respond to the survey. So there is the option for an email response, and that can be directed to the grids2mcr@hamilton.ca email. And Lauren and I can report that we've already started to receive responses over the last few days. So certainly there is a lot of interest. There's also the option to deliver a paper copy of the survey to the mailbox outside of City Hall, if that's an interest. And the reason I bring that up is because we've had questions from people about the option to photocopy the survey or print out a copy of the survey that they've received electronically. And we're trying to discourage people from mailing a photocopied version of this survey back to City Hall. There's some concern that a photocopied version will not be registered by Canada Post through the postage paid option, just because of the different, if it's not the exact dimensions as the original or the paper is a different weight, it might not get to us. So we would suggest, if you do want to photocopy or print out, that it's better to hand deliver it to City Hall, or conversely, you could put it in your own envelope and mail it back as well. But just trying to discourage people from photocopying and then submitting back via the postage paid form. But please remember that email is an equally valid response, and we are tallying email responses as well as the paper responses that we receive. So the survey responses, we are receiving them until July 23rd. So folks have more than a month to respond back. We'll be collating the responses that we receive, both the paper and the email responses, as I mentioned. And then we're going to provide a summary report on the results of the survey to a General Issues Committee meeting in October of this year. So we'll be able to share with everybody and with members of council about what the results were, as well as any comments or any of the other option 3 suggestions that we received through the survey. So that information will be shared in October of this year. So then in terms of next steps, in terms of where we are in our Grids 2 and our MCR process, at the same meeting in March of this year, when Council directed staff to undertake the survey, Council also provided direction for staff to continue on with the Grids 2 work plan that we have been undertaking and evaluating for the past couple of years, to evaluate scenarios under the ambitious density scenario, which, if you recall, did require the urban boundary expansion of about 1,300 hectares, for where that growth could occur. So if ultimately Council does support the need for an urban boundary expansion, if that is the ultimate decision, we need to determine where will that growth occur. Which of those white belt lands would be developed, would be added to the urban area, and when would the development occur. Council also directed that we model and examine that no urban boundary expansion scenario further. And we look at the implications on growth of the no urban boundary expansion scenario. So we're doing both right now at the same time. And that we present these scenarios, the results of our evaluation and modeling, and staff's recommended land needs assessment and preferred growth option at the same General Issues Committee in October of this year. So October is a big month of this year, where we'll be bringing back a lot of information to Council and to share with the public. We will be bringing forward our recommendation and asking Council to endorse our recommendation. But we will not be asking Council to make a final decision at that time. We will be undertaking further consultation. So what we'd be asking is for Council to allow us to go out and consult with the public on the recommended growth option that we have put forward, but that no final decisions are identified in our work plan until early 2022. So there is still time there's still a lot of time allotted in our process for further public consultation after we bring back the results of our modeling and our evaluation of these different growth scenarios. So I want to make that clear. And the scenarios, when we do come back to council, will be evaluated against a range of criteria. So when we're looking at do we support or should we support the ambitious density scenario and any of the different phasing options for growth within that scenario, or the no urban boundary expansion scenario, we have to look at a lot of different impacts. Some of these are on the screen. We've prepared an evaluation framework that we're bringing back to council in August for endorsement, which considers many different theme areas and criteria within those theme areas that we can use to evaluate both the no urban boundary expansion and the ambitious density options. So that's something that we're working on right now. And we did already undertake public consultation on our draft evaluation framework and criteria. And we did receive a number of excellent comments through the Engage Hamilton portal on these draft criteria. So we're just in the works right now of making some adjustments to the criteria, and then we'll be coming back to council for final endorsement of our evaluation framework in August. And again, this is the different themes that we'll be using to help make that decision about the no urban boundary expansion or the ambitious density scenario, along with the feedback that we received from members of the public, and to bring this information before council in October of this year. So that's everything we wanted to share through our presentation tonight. I just noted on the screen that we have a lot more information on our project website, including all of the copies of the different staff reports that have been presented over the years, copy of the land needs assessment and the technical studies supporting that are available for public review, and that you can always reach Lauren and I at the email on the screen if you have any specific questions or are looking for more information. And thank you, and we're happy to answer questions now.
Thank you, Heather and Lauren. And I failed to say that just as an observation, because there was a second to last slide there on evaluation criteria. I think there's been members in our community who have been long-standing in their interest on the urban boundary issue. But I think it would be I think it's accurate to say that the interest in this subject today far exceeds any time in the past. If you were to ask me 10 years ago if the urban boundary was, going to be subject to a survey, public meetings to this degree, and quite topical in different forums, I would have probably said no. So I think that speaks to our growing understanding of the implications of where we grow and how we grow on many of these different themes. And I think that's a good thing that residents are taking a very keen interest in issues as it pertains to city building. So that's also my way of thanking you all again for being in attendance tonight and spreading the word about this survey to your family members, to your friends, and to your neighbors, which I know can be a little difficult during some of the restrictive conditions of COVID, but nonetheless very important. So we'll open up the floor to questions. And
the red areas on the current map, the built-up area, actually have many areas that are available for redevelopment without the need to expand the boundary. Are you able to speak to those areas that are yet to be actually developed and why that doesn't get done before we start talking about expanding outward?
We actually do make the assumption of, when we look at this assumption of 60% of our growth over the next 30 years occurring within the red area or the built-up area, which is 66,000 units. That's a lot more than we've seen in recent years in terms of intensification within this area. Those numbers do assume that vacant lands within the built-up area will be developed over the next 30 years. So there's an assumption that not only will it's limited, the number of vacant parcels within the built-up area, but there is an assumption that those will develop. And of course, there's also an assumption that existing developed parcels within our built up area will redevelop for uses of greater intensity. So there certainly is an assumption that we will see significant development and redevelopment in our downtown along the city's different nodes and corridors. Within, particularly in areas like our Centennial neighborhoods around the future GO station, along Upper James Street. We assume that there will be some development in areas that we call our sub-regional service nodes that are identified in our official plan, and that's Lime Ridge Mall area and Eastgate Square. All of our existing commercial areas have recently been rezoned through a recent citywide zoning process called our commercial and mixed use zoning. So the vast majority of commercial sites could be redeveloped for mixed use. So you could maintain the commercial but add some residential units on top, for example, or redevelop a portion of a parking area for residential uses. So when we say 60% intensification and we talk about those 66,000 units that we've identified for intensification, we are assuming that the vacant portions of our built up area will develop, but also that much of our existing urban area, particularly in the nodes and corridors, will see redevelopment as well.
Has a climate change lens been applied to any of the scenarios?
When staff took a climate change lens looking at the scenarios that we modeled in the LNA, our analysis identified that the ambitious density scenario would best meet climate change objectives because it did result in the least amount of urban boundary expansion. That being said, going forward, and I could extrapolate on that a little bit, but we have not done an evaluation yet of GHG emissions, for example, arising from the different growth scenarios, but that is what is being undertaken over this summer. So we are looking at and going to do modeling of impacts on the city's overall GHG emissions and ability to meet our GHG targets as a result of the no urban boundary expansion scenario, and also as a result of different white belt growth options under the ambitious density scenario. Because as I mentioned, there's different areas the city could grow into and in different phasing of that growth. So we will be taking a GHG emissions modeling exercise to look at the implications from the different growth scenarios using that climate lens.
The school board closed several schools in the past few years because the population was predicted to decline. How does this reconcile with prediction for growth, for such large growth?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's not something that I'm necessarily an expert on. I think the growth numbers that we have and that we are planning for as a city and that we receive from the province are citywide numbers. So they tell us that as a city, we're going to grow by 236,000 people and that we have to accommodate that growth using this market-based forecast. So we have to make sure that we're planning for a certain number of single family dwellings as well as townhouses and apartments. That growth that growth forecast doesn't, when you just look at that whole number, it doesn't identify that there's areas of the city that might be seeing less growth or decline versus other areas that are growing more rapidly. So certainly the fact that overall the city is growing more rapidly does not mean that we'll be seeing the same pace of growth in all neighborhoods within the city. So that's why we will still see schools, unfortunately, that have to close in neighborhoods. What I would say, and I think most people on this call obviously understand that, is some more intensification though that we can plan for within these neighborhoods, and the more we can keep people in the neighborhoods and bring more people into the neighborhoods, the more that will support those services that in the past have seen some decline, and not only schools but local businesses as well. Intensification is certainly a huge benefit to helping keep our existing neighborhoods thriving.
When he can expect to see the survey land in his mailbox?
Any day now, if you haven't received it yet. I received mine just today, but I know that other people received theirs on Monday. So Canada Post did tell us that it just depends on what they call their walk mail routes throughout their different routes across the city, and we should expect that it'll vary across neighborhoods. I would suggest so. If you haven't received your survey by early next week, get in touch through that email that I had shown, and we can provide it again at the end of the meeting and let us know. We can certainly email you a copy at any time, even before that. But let us know if you haven't received it by early next week, because then if we start hearing from numerous people that they haven't received it, maybe we can do some follow-up and find out if there was an issue with the delivery in certain neighborhoods. But I would say I'm hopeful that you will receive it. If you didn't receive it today, it should be tomorrow, but let us know if it's any longer than that.
Council just decided to do an independent peer review of the Laureus Land Needs Assessment. What changes might occur as a result? And could this change the view of the planning department?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that is a recent development. The peer review is being undertaken to ensure that the land needs assessment was conducted in accordance with provincial policies and requirements, including the land needs assessment methodology. So essentially that it was undertaken correctly, that the correct assumptions were made. So in terms of what changes could occur as a result, I would suggest that if the peer review identified errors or any issues with the methodology, then we would have to redo some of that land needs assessment work. And again, without having any benefit of what the results of the peer review are right now, this was only directed yesterday, I believe. That's just off the top of my head, but if issues were identified, then we would certainly undertake to address them. And then we would see if addressing those issues that were identified, does that actually result in any change in terms of overall land need? It may or it may not. It depends what the issue is. And then certainly if there was a change and the overall land need requirement changed, then we would have to amend the scenarios that we're planning for, et cetera, as a result. So if it's no longer 1,300 hectares that are identified under the ambitious density scenario and it's less, then we would be planning for less of an urban expansion. Whether or not it would change overall staff's recommendation going forward, I really can't comment on that yet, just because I have nothing in front of me to say what any issues might be or what the changes could be resulting from the land needs assessment. And of course, it could be that the peer review is undertaken and there's no issues identified and then there's no changes. Really, we don't know the result yet.
Many older people I know want to downsize. Is she correct in thinking that the local forecasts assume almost all older folks will age in place?
No, it doesn't assume that all older folks will want to age in place. It does assume that there will be turnover of the housing stock over time. And again, I'm not a forecaster, but I do know that the provincial forecasts have have made the assumption and included that in their analysis that there would be turnover of the housing stock when older folks do decide to sell their home that they've been in for years and downsize or move to any other sort of facility. What I do know and what we have been told by our land economist is that amount of turnover in and of itself is not enough to accommodate all of the demand for single family homes going forward. So again, we are mandated by the province to plan for a market range of housing. So we have to plan for a certain number of single detached homes and other low density options, as well as higher density options. And there will not be enough turnover in the housing stock to, in and of itself, accommodate all of the demand for the lower density housing types.
Can I just interject there on that part, because we haven't spent any time talking about the market-based approach, and my understanding is it's a new element that's been introduced, and I was wondering if you could talk about. You've just referenced it. It's not a housing policy per se. It is a requirement in the methodology, I think, that we are to accommodate certain types of housing. So unit types that must be baked in to the outcome. So could you spend a few minutes talking about what this is and what the consequences of it could be?
Yeah, it's definitely, and you're correct, Councillor. It is a new direction that came with the most recent version of the growth plan from the province and the most recent land needs assessment methodology. So those two important documents that we get from the province and that we're required to plan in accordance with. So there's policies within the growth plan itself now that talk about municipalities planning for a market-based range of housing. And then the method itself also talks about planning for that market-based forecast. And really what that means is exactly as you said, that there's a background document to that overall population forecast number that is within the growth plan that's prepared by a group called Hempson Consulting. And it's another land economist group. And within that document, it identifies what is considered to be the market range of housing types for Hamilton. And that is a significant number of single detached homes, as well as medium density or different types of townhouses and apartment units. So we as a city, when we're conducting our land needs assessment, we have to the greatest of our abilities, plan for that full range of housing types to ensure that we are providing that market-based mix of housing. So one of the concerns that's been raised with the no urban boundary expansion option is that the resulting housing mix that comes out of that option is going to be very predominantly comprised of apartment units, because most of the intensification that we see is in the form of apartments. We do not see as much single or semi-detached houses being built as intensification units. I'm not saying we don't see any, we certainly do see some. Certainly we do. And there's always opportunities to encourage more of that, but the vast majority is in the form of apartments. And so one of the concerns is that the no urban boundary expansion option, because it plans for so many apartments, it does not meet that provincial requirement for a market-based housing forecast. And that is a significant concern of staff, in that we need to have our land needs assessment and ultimately our municipal comprehensive review approved by the province. And if they do not approve the work that we have completed and that we submit to them, they could instead direct Hamilton to redo the work using what they consider a market-based approach, or they could just on their own make changes to our official plan, which then takes the control away from staff altogether. So it's a very important point, and the impact, though I don't mind saying it, the impact of a market-based range of housing does mean that there may be more of a greater urban boundary expansion land need, because we are being forced to plan for singles and towns, which take up more space.
Yeah. So I'm going to just add one more thing, and then I'm going to shut up, because it's not for me, it's for you. But I just would like to take this opportunity to say that is the most fundamental, in my opinion, change, because it is forcing municipalities to incorporate in their plans and therefore their assumptions a type of housing. And so my supplementary question to you on that is what provincial interest, therefore public interest, what provincial public interest is being met by forcing municipalities to incorporate a market-based approach? Can you answer that, or if you'd rather not? I think I have.
No,
my
I mean,
opinion,
I don't want to speak for necessarily the province's intentions of putting it in. Providing a range and a mix of housing types has always been a planning goal. That goes without saying. I think we can all agree that, ideally communities have a range of housing types, but this has gone beyond that and really forcing this market-based approach. So I think when the province released these documents, they talked about encouraging and bringing more housing supply onto the market more quickly. Whether or not that is a true outcome of this approach, I don't think anybody knows yet. But again, I don't want to speak too much for the province's intentions. When they put
fair enough.
Council voted to declare a climate emergency. Glad to see that climate change is number one. All 5 of these lenses favor a no boundary expansion. Halton is studying greenhouse gas emissions for each of their scenarios. Their best model is a 3B no boundary expansion with 80% densification, no greenfield expansion. If number 1 is climate change, are we studying greenhouse gases for each of those 2 scenarios?
Yes, we are. So that's work that's being done now. It will be It will be done over the summer, and it is being completed through the city's consultant who is working on the community energy plan, which I believe is actually the same group who did this modeling for Halton. I could be wrong, but I believe it is because I've been following their process as well. So yes, the answer is yes, we are looking at the impact on emissions from both scenarios being no urban boundary expansion and ambitious density, and the different options within the ambitious density scenario.
Isn't the city already averaging 50% density coming from infill projects? Why does the ambitious expansion plan not increase that for the next 10 years?
The clarification I'd make there is the city is not averaging 50%. I think it's intensification that we're talking about here, but we certainly have seen the numbers rise over the past couple of years. It was 50% we did achieve 50% in 2019, and I believe in 2020 as well. But before that, the numbers were quite a lot lower. So the 10-year or so average in intensification is still much lower. It's in the high 30s to low 40s range. But you're absolutely correct that we have been seeing an upward trend. So we're essentially, the ambitious density that we're putting forward is assuming that that upward trend will continue, which is actually a big assumption. If you do look, and I don't have the numbers on a slide, but if you look at the intensification rates over the last 10 years, they've fluctuated rather significantly. So it can go be 30% one year, and then 40, and then 50, and then way back down again. The numbers are quite sensitive to even one large project in any given year can really have an impact on the overall number. So to assume that we're going to achieve 50% every year for the next 10 years is actually a big assumption. It's also in line with a background report that the city had completed, a residential intensification market demand report, because we were really struggling with what is an appropriate intensification target to recommend going forward, knowing that it's not just the potential supply that we have to think about of intensification areas, but also the demand side, and what is the market demand for intensification in Hamilton going to be going forward. And that report mentioned that for the short term, so for the next 10 years, 50% is really the highest that we should be going, and that represents what it called an aspirational target. So on that basis, 50% is a reasonable target going for the short term, and then gradually pushing it up to 70% in the latter stages. And then the only other note on that, and again, I can provide numbers if you kind of want to dig into the data a little bit more, but the overall growth that we're seeing, forecasted growth, so the yearly housing unit increase is increasing a lot as time goes by. So we're now talking about 50% of a greater number of overall units every year being within our built up area. So that actual 50% of a larger number means obviously many more intensification units that we're assuming are going to be built every year within the built up area than we've seen in the past. So that's why staff are comfortable with the 50% in the short term. If we're successful with that, if we keep going, because we will have opportunities in the future to look back and monitor and see how we're doing, then obviously the 60% and the 70% make more sense in the later years.
Are we looking to other municipalities around Ontario and beyond that are intensifying within their existing boundaries with ambitious density targets that are still livable communities, i.e. they have cycling and trees and parkland and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly staying in tune with what other municipalities are planning and recommending. All greater Golden Horseshoe municipalities are undertaking the same process that we are right now, the Municipal Comprehensive Review. So we're certainly keeping an eye on that and seeing how we, how we compare with some of our assumptions and our recommendations compared to our peers. And from what I've seen in the draft work that's been done, we are in line with that in most cases in terms of trying to push targets up as high as we're comfortable going, and certainly exceeding density and intensification targets that we've ever planned for in the past. It's an interesting question, though, in terms of the questions that are still livable communities. I mean, I think all of our neighboring municipalities and all of our Ontario municipalities are trying to plan to create livable communities. That's what we're doing as well. But we do look and try to look at best practices from other neighborhoods. I know Ottawa's, I think, in their new official plan is looking at the 15-minute community, and I think that's an interesting concept. So there's always, we'll keep an eye on that and see how they are going to embed those policies within their official plan. There's always things that we can learn from other municipalities, but in general, with the recommendations that we're making right now, we're generally in line with what others are proposing, but most municipalities are at the same stage that we are, where everything is draft and not final right now, so things can change going forward.
If there's any planning process to allow for other species, so this is all planned around people and how people are expanding, but when you're doing this, what planning is there for other species beyond just human beings? Do we consider our environment and the impact that we have?
So that's what, as part of the evaluation, the growth options evaluation that we're looking at right now, and that we'll be coming back with some reports on in October, is looking at impacts on the natural environment and looking at the growth. This is more looking at the different white belt growth options, looking at the existing conditions of these different areas, information that we have on natural heritage features and core areas, species at risk, et cetera, within these areas. And looking at, is there any opportunities we have through recommendations on where we're going to grow and when we're going to grow to be cognizant of impact on these natural features. Certainly, there's a lot of protections in place just provincially and through our existing official plan where these features are protected, and through future planning phases for any of these growth areas through the secondary planning phase and block servicing strategies and sub-watershed studies, these features will be protected. That goes without saying. At this high level process, though, we don't have all of that detailed information yet for all of these growth areas. So we do the best we can with the information we have to look at potential impacts and how they can be mitigated through the process. But a lot of that detailed work would come through the next phases.
Secondary dwelling units could address the requirements for single-family homes. Are there any incentives in place for SDUs? She knows that there's some people experiencing in Ancaster who are prevented from doing this because of the size of their front driveways. It is more than 50% of their front lawn. Rules like this make SDUs hard to promote. So are there any incentives for SDUs within a program?
And this SDU zoning regulations were actually just approved for the urban area to make it, well, to increase flexibility to allow SDUs citywide as of right within any single detached semi or townhouse. So that flexibility has already just been increased dramatically through the recent zoning amendments. I know it's not perfect. Now I didn't work particularly on that project, so I don't know all of the details of some of these constraints that people are facing. So I know it's not perfect, and I know that not every lot or existing dwelling will meet the regulations for an SDU. But the idea behind the new regulations is that many more people will, as of right, be able to put either a detached dwelling unit on their property or an accessory unit in their basement or both. And that if there is a regulation that needs to be amended to allow you to do that, then there's also been a process put in place to make that faster and cheaper. So if you do need a minor variance to address a zoning regulation, then that process will not be as costly. So the city is trying to make this easier. And we've certainly done that with the most recent update to the SDU zoning regs. It's very new, though. It only was passed in April. So there's going to be a learning curve as we hear different, there's problems or complaints, and through future updates, maybe there'll be changes to make it even easier. But as of right now, that was a very big win, I think, for the city to get those SDU regulations passed. And that we do certainly assume that those, particularly the detached single secondary dwelling units, so that could be like a laneway house or an accessory building in your backyard, those will account for a certain amount of our intensification growth going forward. We do assume that, and they do count toward our requirement for providing single detached homes, because they are classified as that for the purposes of our land needs assessment. So it's an important part of our planning going forward, and the city's just passed that zoning, which is really going to facilitate that and make it a lot easier.
You mentioned a breakdown of new developments. What are the ratios of these? Since the prices of housing is becoming so inflated, will this affect the type of housing developments being created? How will the varying levels of income of Hamiltons have the varying incomes of Hamiltonians been accounted for this in the development?
So under the ambitious density scenario that staff are recommending, again, that's just a recommendation, and that's not final. The breakdown by unit type under that recommendation is about 25% singles and semis, 25% towns, and 50% apartments. So it is still heavily weighted toward apartments going forward, but we do have more of that, the lower density forms of housing. In terms of housing prices, I don't have the answer to that. I don't think anybody has the answer to that right now. We do know that it's important to get supply on the market of any type of unit to help address some of these shortages, but the answer to the current housing, the prices, which are just so astronomical, I don't have the answer to that, and I certainly can't say that the work that we're doing now is going to solve that. I would never try to say that at all. In terms of the question about how will levels of incomes or how have income levels been accounted for, again, this work, it's very high level, and it just looks at providing the units and the range of units. It doesn't get into, and the forecasts aren't based on looking at a certain amount of affordable housing. Unfortunately, at this level, that we don't, that's not considered through the provincial forecasts. Certainly, though, provision of affordable housing and other low-income housing forms is a priority for the city, and we're doing concurrently with this process, we're also commencing work on our official plan review to look at other issues, not just from this growth management perspective, and looking at our affordable housing targets and our policies around that, and options to encourage more affordable housing in the future is something that is being looked at. It's just not embedded directly in this work or through the forecasts that we're planning for right now.
Michelle asks and says, the provincial population forecast will be investigated by the Auditor General in a report in December. Why make a decision in October when the report is coming down in December? We know that the Ministry of Finance forecasts are not consistent with the Hemsen forecast.
So the Hemsen forecast is the background document that was prepared to inform the growth plan forecasts, population and job forecasts for all of Greater Golden Horseshoe municipalities. So that's where we got our projected growth number for Hamilton, for example, of 820,000 people. The Hemsen forecast is not the same as the Ministry of Finance forecast, and that has always been the case, even with previous versions of the growth plan. The Ministry of Finance forecasts are straight, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I've certainly learned in terms of the forecasting itself, but I've learned a lot through this project. And what I understand is the Ministry of Finance forecasts are just straight population forecasts with no policy intervention or kind of geographic interventions, whereas the Hemsen forecast takes that Ministry of Finance forecast or uses the same base assumptions about population growth, looking at immigration trends and age pyramids and all of the different tools that they use to project population, but applies a lens to it, to a regional lens, to where the growth will occur among the different municipalities, and then also somewhat of a policy lens to encourage growth, encourage intensification, encourage the different objectives of the province from a policy perspective. So it's noted, and it's very much acknowledged that the two forecasts are not the same, but that they're not intended to either. They're intended for different uses. As for investigation by the Auditor General, I don't know enough about that to comment on that. We are proceeding with our work plan to make to bring forward our recommended growth option in October, just because the province is telling us we need to be finished our process by July of next year, which means that we need to keep moving. We don't have the luxury of a lot of time if we are going to strive to meet that provincial deadline. So that's why we are carrying forward.
Is there any consideration in the planning process to encourage developers who have held undeveloped parcels for a considerable amount of time to build on their lands?
Yeah, I mean, what we try to do from a planning point of view is to make it as easy as possible for redevelopment to occur by putting proper zoning in place as of right. So if somebody does want to redevelop their parcel, they don't have to go through the extra hurdle of applying for rezoning, which is a public process and can sometimes cause delays if there's neighborhood opposition. We try to put a planning applications approval process in place to make approvals as quick and easy as possible. So for our site plan approval process, it's designed to allow a developer to get an approval fairly quickly up front, and then they have to work through meeting conditions, but they can be as expedient as they can be, as they're able to be. It puts the control in their favor. So, from a developer's point of view, those kind of things can make a big difference to their bottom line, being able to see their process be streamlined. But we don't have the power to force a landowner to redevelop their property. There's draft plan of subdivisions on Hamilton Mountain that have been in the draft approval stage for decades, but they haven't been developed, and it's frustrating for us from a planning point of view. It's frustrating, I'm sure, for neighbors who want to see their neighborhoods finished, but the city has very limited resources to force that redevelopment to occur. So it's an excellent question, and it's something I think is a cause of frustration in many ways, but our powers to force things to occur are limited, but we try our best through incentives that we do have through zoning, as I said, and planning approvals processes.
Heather mentioned that phase 2 will identify when and where expansion will occur. What, if any, work is currently underway to identify which areas inside the current urban boundary can be used for development, which, relates to what you just said, but maybe we can just...
So there was a report that was released when we released our draft land needs assessment, which was an intensification supply update, where staff had gone through and done the work to look at various supply or various opportunities for intensification throughout our built up area. And the number is large. I think it was well over 80,000 units, I believe, which was identified as and then that was a fairly conservative number. That was sites or opportunities for redevelopment that we thought could realistically occur over the next 30 years, without a lot of need for push or outside intervention. So that we have done that work, and we do assume, because I know there's a lot of concern in the community about parking lots and other underutilized spaces, and why can't we develop those first? And I think it's an excellent point, and we do want to see those areas developed, and we do assume through those studies that we do that there will be redevelopment in those areas. But similar to what I was just saying, we can't force the development to occur. The city is not in the process of buying, generally, with very few exceptions, of buying up the properties and forcing the redevelopment to occur. There has to be a willing landowner who wants to make the leap to redevelop their one-story commercial plaza, which, with vacancies, into a mixed-use building with some residential on top. There has to be an incentive for them to do that, and there has to be, something through their own reasons why they undertake that. So we do absolutely recognize that there's many supply opportunities for intensification within our built-up area. The key, though, is that it's not just the supply of the sites that matter; it's the demand. And we have to balance, when we put forward our recommendation for intensification, we're balancing that supply and demand and landing on a number that we think is reasonable to achieve over the next 30 years. And the number that we're recommending in our mind, from our professional opinion, is reasonable, but it's going to be challenging, very, very challenging. But that being said, Nancy, we are still going right now and undergoing additional work to do some more modeling of what a no urban boundary expansion option looks like, so that we can be more detailed when we report back to Council in October about unit allocation. It would be a potential scenario for where all of the units that right now we have identified would be accommodated through urban boundary expansion. If we were to take those and shift that into the urban boundary, what is a plausible or reasonable scenario for that? And then we'll be modeling that and then be able to say, okay, based on that scenario, what are the greenhouse gas emissions? What's the fiscal impact? Climate, other climate impacts, transportation. So we are doing that work, but I just don't want it to be seeing that we haven't already, we do consider these opportunities for redevelopment within our urban area, and we know there's many. It's just being able to push those opportunities to the next phase of being realized and what actually might be realized over the next 30 years. That's the challenge.
Back to the GHG calculations. Will they be done for growth within the current boundary? The boundary expansion would not be dense enough to support regular public transportation.
Yes. So the first answer to the first question is yes. And the comment on the public transportation, it's a good point. Getting transit to the new greenfield areas is a challenge. But certainly some, the areas, they are being planned to be developed at, sorry, I shouldn't say they are. If we do approve an urban boundary expansion, those areas would be planned to at a much higher density than we've typically seen. And if you think of an area, for example, like Elfrida in the Upper Stony Creek area, it would be planned for a density that would support transit. It's built around an existing node in that area. So it's not to say that none of the white belt areas would be able to achieve transit. We ideally would want to see that for all of the areas, and that is a criteria we'd be looking at. But the density in these areas, if these areas are approved and if they eventually do become part of the urban area, they will be more dense than what we're used to seeing in newly developing areas.
And just piggyback on that, will the GHG emission study results be made public? And will those results influence the city's decision on boundary issues?
Yes, they will. And then they will be reported to as part of the information package that's provided in the fall, and will influence staff's recommendation and then obviously provided to council for their information and their decision making as well.
Are there different costs to the city related to each of these two scenarios for growth? For example, how might infrastructure costs differ between the two scenarios?
Yes, I would say there will be different costs, and I know that's another key concern. And so the fiscal impact assessment of the growth scenarios will also look at both the no urban boundary expansion option and the growth option. I don't have the answers right now because that study hasn't been completed. There are definitely costs to growing outward. That goes without saying. The city, there's new infrastructure required, new transportation requirements. Certainly, though, a portion of that growth, or much of that growth, is paid for by through development charges. Not perfect, but there is an opportunity for the city to recoup costs in that way. But no, there is definitely a cost to outward growth, but there is a cost to growing up within our urban area too. That one can be harder to quantify though, because it can be a different cost for different areas of the city, depending on the infrastructure that's in the ground right now, capacity, and other issues. Stormwater management can be very difficult to accommodate within the existing urban area. So there are costs to growing up, there's costs to growing out, and that is something that we're going to be reporting on as well. In the fall.
We're still seeing builders wanting to fill almost every inch of landscape in their developments. Will the city implement requirements for proportionate green spaces among intensified construction? His point is that people do require outdoor spaces.
Definitely people, require outdoor spaces. And I think that's become, more transparent over the past year than ever before. So yeah, that's a good and it's a very timely question. So the city right now is reviewing, and this is a kind of another project that's being undertaken by our group, not by Lauren and myself, but some of our other colleagues, of updating the residential zoning bylaw. And through that process, they are looking at regulations and opportunities for just what you're saying here about in the different forms of residential development, so requirements for low density and medium density and high density, how to ensure amenity space is present, what's an appropriate amount of amenity space, and what zoning regulations can be put in place to ensure that we get it. There's a climate perspective there from, incorporating low impact development techniques and permeable surfaces. So those considerations are being undertaken right now. Right now, it's the low density zones that are being looked at. So not so much right now that the medium and the high are going to be the next round, I guess, commencing next year. But there's going to be green development standards being created as well as we go forward, and those will again be tailored to the different types of development. So that's something that we're moving forward on. The existing zoning bylaws for the different municipalities aren't always very strong in that, and some of them are quite dated. So the new zoning is a chance for us to really improve on some of those requirements and see future development, coming to a higher standard than we've seen in the past to the best of our ability. So that's a work in progress, but it is something that's definitely on the radar.
Jane is saying, can intensification be placed along the LRT line or transit-oriented corridor and then have less space used in the White Belt ambitious plan?
Yeah, so definitely intensification is planned or assumed to occur, that it will occur along the corridor. That corridor is it's been identified in our official plan as a priority transit corridor since our urban plan was approved back in 2009. So it's always been identified as an area of the city to accommodate more growth and intensification, and it will continue to do so. The LRT, though, is a huge benefit to helping the city see and achieve more intensification along that corridor. We really do see it as a chance to help us fulfill some of these challenging targets that we're planning for. But the answer to, does it mean that we will does it change the land needs assessment outcome for the ambitious density scenario? Is no. Again, it goes back to that market forecast that the intensification that we would foresee along the LRT line would be primarily in the form of apartments, maybe some towns. That is a potential, but we wouldn't be expecting to see significant amounts of single and other low density forms of housing. So there is still that requirement to meet that market demand for the low density housing. But strictly on the intensification side and allowing the city to meet our intensification numbers, the LRT is considered to be, will be a significant benefit in that regard.
To reach the density targets within the urban growth boundary, will zoning changes be made? How will the location of zoning changes be determined?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes along with what I was just mentioning about the new zoning program or the new residential zoning that's underway right now. So right now the focus is on the low density zoning. But I do know that it is on that team's work plan to look at zoning along certain corridors and areas of the city where there might be potential to, I guess, upzone, you would call it, and allow for more higher density uses as of right. There's certain corridors in the city that still have, they're identified as corridors in our plan, and the corridors are meant to be areas where you might see some mixed use development or some opportunity for higher density development, but they still have remnant zoning from long ago, which is more of a low density zone. So there will be an opportunity to look at that through the zoning program, which is nice that it is somewhat going parallel to the process that we're undertaking. So yes, there will. I think we haven't put too much thought of that because the zoning is a little bit behind right now. But I would say that yes, there will be some recommendations from our study that could be implemented through that future zoning program.
Is there a point or threshold at which the provincial government would recognize the climate impact in terms of GHGs that come from this market-based approach?
That I can't answer what the province's approach would be. Yeah, I don't know. All we can do as a city is do our work by modeling and showing what the impacts are, and then making sure that our council can make an informed choice. What the province does in that regard, I really can't comment on.
The average family size continues to shrink while new home size keeps increasing. Can there be a push for smaller and correspondingly more affordable homes? that could easily double the number of housing units, and many people would appreciate this option as it's not currently available. So this is speaking a little bit to how do we bring in affordable housing and stop the monster sprawl.
Yeah, and it's a good question and definitely a challenge. I mean, I think the secondary dwelling units somewhat are going to assist with this, and that there is that option then to have smaller and more affordable units as of right on the property. And, you know, I do know just from anecdotally from talking to our development planners who get inquiries, you know, at the development counter, there's always been a lot of inquiries and a lot of interest in this option. So now that it has been made easier for people to undertake, I know it's not perfect, but it is much easier. Then hopefully we'll see that continue to increase as to be available as an option. And then, as I said, affordable housing, it's a challenge, and it's something that's needs to be looked at and needs to be examined. Our numbers don't necessarily reflect that right now. We don't have the option through this particular land needs assessment work to speak to affordability, but it is certainly something that that's a priority for planning staff going forward. But in my opinion, I think the SDUs and the zoning regulations to allow people to have up to 3 units now on their property, that's huge, and that can certainly create opportunities going forward within our existing neighborhoods. That's always a challenge is within our existing neighborhoods, how to intensify in there in a way that's acceptable to the community. We don't want them to be static and not change. So this is a way that we can see numbers in existing neighborhoods increase in a way that, you know, is not going to create, you know, some of the backlash that we get in some of the other intensification projects that we see come forward. So I think the SDUs was a really big win for the city, and will make a difference going forward.
Maureen, you might be able to speak to this because of some activity that's taken around the council table. Does Hamilton still allow landlords to have buildings sit unoccupied, or as a or has the rule since changed? The same should apply to property owners that have land sitting without any buildings on it.
I think there's two things I could say to that. My understanding is there was on commercial properties, there was the elimination of they were moving on a different tax option. And I know there should be a report coming forward soon assisting council in considering taxing vacant homes. So Vancouver and Toronto very recently have put in a vacancy tax. And ideally what you're supposed to do, and anyways, from what I've been reading, is you do that in advance of your housing crisis in terms of cost. We're there now, but it doesn't mean that we should look at it. The challenge is the cost of putting it in place, and the administration thereof is quite significant. But if done correctly, and if it suits our municipality, the revenues that could be garnered are significant. And so it becomes a deterrent. Again, these are, this is a land use system based on private property rights. So these are owned by private interests, and we can't force them to develop their lands, but we can make it more expensive for them to just sit on the land. So that's one of the objectives in our taxation policies.
Are we considering transportation concurrently with the grid study, i.e. the truck study, transportation, traffic, complete streets, all that kind of stuff?
My overall thing is I always consider transportation planning and land use planning are like peas and carrots. You cannot, you can't consider one without the other. And the goals and objectives of land use planning have to be supported by your transportation investments. And that's why I have always argued that there's a reason the farmers in Kitchener-Waterloo never wavered in their commitment to LRT. They weren't necessarily strong advocates of public transit, but they understood very clearly that having high quality, high order transit within the developed area in the urban area was going to ease the development pressure on them. They stayed within that coalition of support and they never left it. So again, that is, and I would argue that you cannot be an advocate of green space, and you cannot be an advocate of smart growth and not support LRT. And those are my words, those are not staff's, obviously.
It is considered within the study the one of the guiding foundations of grids is that it is an integrated study. So we work with our staff in transportation and in infrastructure planning so that we can understand the implications, transportation implications and other servicing implications of any growth options. We have also been keeping abreast and working with staff on the transportation or the truck route master plan update to be aware of and be able to comment on proposed changes to that plan from our growth management perspective and vice versa. So our projects inform each other. But yes, there is definitely a transportation lens on our work, and there will continue to be when we look at the growth scenarios and we look at impacts on our transportation system arising from the different growth options.
No matter what intensification rate is selected, Hamilton is going to need to intensify to house our residents at a much more significant rate than we've previously seen in our city. This offers challenges and opportunities for the city. How can we ensure we have positive conversations about the residential intensification rate to ensure that this new housing, that new housing units get built so residents are not needing to move out of Hamilton to find suitable housing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and it is one of the challenges, right? And I'm sure that the councillor can attest to many public meetings and planning committee where there's tremendous opposition to intensification projects. Not always, some of them certainly go more smoothly than others, but it is a barrier or a challenge that that can be faced by developers when they're trying to push a project forward because of the concern from the community, and it can certainly their concern can be justified, absolutely, but in some cases perhaps education or explanation of the benefits of intensification, some of which we touched on earlier about bringing, or if not bringing additional people into a neighborhood, keeping a neighborhood population stable so it can support the services and the businesses and the schools that are there. There's tremendous benefits to intensification, allowing more housing opportunities in a neighborhood, allowing people to move from one housing type to another. So I think education is huge, and we've noted that before as something that would be beneficial to the community. The challenge is getting out there. We as planners, we try to get out and talk to the community as much as we can, and we're out, we often visit neighborhood meetings and different associations and speak to these issues, and we'll continue to try to do that. But it's somewhat, maybe word of mouth can be helpful, as we can offer more success stories for excellent examples of intensification within neighborhoods. We can start to get the word out, because it is one of the challenges that I would identify to the city meeting these higher rates of intensification, is being able to reduce the opposition that sometimes comes with intensification projects. So I don't know if the councillor has anything else to add on that, because certainly planning committee, we do see a lot of that, but
well, yeah, no, I mean, that's very well said, and it is politically challenging. And, there's an expression I often use, everybody wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die to get there. And by that, I mean, we want green space, we want clean air, we want tight boundaries, but that means that our own existing neighborhoods are going to have to change and accommodate. And I think we all start out our adult lives, at least most of us, as renters. And potentially we might end our lives in a rental situation. And I just think that if we could focus on design and then know that I think every resident in Hamilton should have the ability to live in any part of Hamilton, because mixed incomes, mixed neighborhoods, I think are richer for it. And like an ecosystem, if it's all one type of person, it's not sustainable and it's not healthy. So, but it is challenging politically. People don't like change in their neighborhoods. So I would just like to thank everyone who attended tonight in whole, or if you were joined us in part. Thank you very much. This is a really important subject matter. It's not easy, and And the questions that were asked tonight were really good and rich and showed the complexity of this subject matter. I would also like to extend my thanks to Heather and Lauren. I think what many people do not realize is the amount of work that public servants do and the number of hours that they put in. I don't think I fully appreciated it because it had been a while since I'd been there, but they're really, we're very, very fortunate to have such committed public servants, and I'm very grateful every day for their professionalism and their integrity, and that's really important that we get that professional advice and the integrity, because it's what good policy outcomes depend on. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I hope you all have a great weekend, and fill out your survey. If you put it in the blue box, go get it, tell your neighbors. And if all else fails, give us a call and we'll make sure you get one. So thank you all very much.